All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is fair to say that Prydwen's last update kind of ruffled a couple of feathers. And I'm here, I'm ready. Let's talk about what actually happened. We all know that in the second half of version 2.1, a character released in the game, none other than Brant. And his placement on the tier list is something that a lot of players are, frankly, a little bit upset about. Let me go ahead and show you all, before we dive into the tier list itself, some of the opinions that people are having on the matter. We've got this post over here, and we got this post over here. Prydwen tier list. It is trash for me. Jian T1, Changli T1, Brant T1, Yinlin T1, Rosia T1. These are really bad. No other explanation. I still think they didn't test for shit. There is no way they thought Carlotta was worse than Jinxie or Phoebe for WhiWa. Mortifi has 2 teams. There's a lot of comments. There's a lot of complaints. There's a lot of concerns. People are a little bit upset. And that's just from some of the top posts that we're seeing over here. That's just from some of the top posts that we're seeing over here. So let's go ahead, let's dive right on into it, and let's see why people are a little bit pissed with what's going on. When it comes to the changelog, our first Whimpering Waste tier list update is here. Brant just released, and a ton of revisions to our past characters have been made. There's a lot of material to go over, so we didn't finish everything for the entire character cast. However, we're happy to announce we extensively revised our list of tier list assessments for every character on both tier lists. And we revised our rotations for around half of the character cast as well. Not everything is on the website yet, so we might take a look at some of those things, but the rest will be up soon. This was done because we revamped the expert tag and some character rankings along with it. How we'll go about it from now is feature every character placement at a strictly casual level, following the definition in our tier list criteria section. However, the expert tag is now allowed to cover discrepancies of more than one tier. In the future, this can be as many tiers as needed, but as things stand, certain characters have gotten the expert +1, which means if they're played very well, they're 1 spot above on the tier list, and others have gotten the expert +2, which means if they're played very well, they're 2 spots up on the tier list. So we'll see which characters have that tag. Additionally, for visualization purposes, we're clarifying on everyone's character icon that they're graded at S0R0. So that means no sequence nodes and no limited 5-star weapons. It doesn't change anything to our rankings, just makes things easier to visualize for everyone. I think that that's something that a lot of people weren't factoring in when it came to Prydwen's tier list, and I think it leads into a lot of an explanation for what the rankings are for certain characters like Brant or Jian. Not having the SIG can be a big power loss for some units on the roster, while it's not as much of a power loss for others. So that's a bit of an explanation. It's been like that the entire time, but they're clarifying it now for a lot of people. So with that, we're separating our changelog into 2 categories. So let's tackle the TOA first. Brant is added as tier 1. Depending on how you're viewing the situation, that can be viewed as a little bit low because there's still tier 0.5 and there's going to be tier 0.0 at the very top. Brant's very strong. He welcomes quick swap with other mid-air characters like Changli, even though it's not really even necessary. His playstyle is very straightforward. He deals a ton of damage. He heals and shields your party. He has a great outro buff. And to summarize, everything about him is pretty good. However, a ton of his potential is locked behind his SIG, even more than Yinlin. And I've covered this in my guide as well. He is one of the most signature reliant characters in the game. His ceiling with his signature is absurdly high. So high to the point where he's an amazing hyper carry, despite being so tailored around being a sub DPS. But if you don't have his SIG, his performance is kind of doo-doo water, with the only real competition with this SIG being an R5 Emerald of Genesis and 250 ER on the Tide-Breaking Courage set, which is, you know, you need 5 copies of Emerald of Genesis to get that done. It offers him big amounts of energy regen, his SIG, and a ton of extra damage on top. This makes it the only weapon that really allows him to fully utilize his signature Echo set, Tide-Breaking Courage, while still being worth it for his total damage. With his weapon included, he'd likely land around tier 0.5. However, too much of his damage is locked behind it, so we're leaving him comfortably in tier 1. That's the real explanation here. I don't think a lot of people saw this part. They only look at where the placement is on the tier list, and they're drawing some crazy conclusions, right? Because a lot of people, like myself, are probably very pleasantly surprised with how well Brant does with his SIG. But without it, he has a bundle of issues, namely Overture being complete dog shit on him. The reason why Overture is just completely dog shit on the character is pretty simple. Even if you're using the tie-breaking courage set, this weapon has absolutely no fucking effect on him. His entire rotation gives him full concerto energy anyways. And so by having this weapon on him, despite the fact that it gives ER, its weapon effect is completely fucking utterly useless. It does not do anything at all. It does literally nothing. And so his Sig giving ER and way more offensive stats is kind of like the difference maker here. And like I said before, EOG on Molten Rift is actually better than Overture on Tie-Breaking Courage. So that's how the cookie crumbles for him, unfortunately. Going back to the tier list, Calcharo has been adjusted with the expert tag +2. It should be no surprise to many that Calcharo has the biggest meta discrepancy between a casual player and an expert one who's willing to learn all of his optimizations. Things like his basic attack canceling in his Liberation and the 4DM combo. The new expert tag revamp was done mostly because of him, because, I mean, he kind of does deserve the extra placement if he's being played well, and it's impossible to depict his meta position accurately without this kind of clarification. So I'm glad they added it. I'm glad they expanded the definition of the expert tag, because when Calcharo is played in the sweatiest way possible, uses all of his cancels, and is able to optimize his damage, he will even outperform characters like Zhang Liao. But getting those stars to align so that he can actually get off those rotations is one of the hardest things in the game. So good luck to any Calcharo mains who are willing to learn all of his optimizations. It's really difficult, but very rewarding. Kind of what I just said. Chang Li's going down from tier 0.5 to tier 1. She's going down, ladies and gentlemen, and that's because at a casual level, she's kind of hard to play well. But because of that, she's now had an expert tag added to her that puts her up 2 positions. So that means she is tier 0 if you are playing her really, really, really well. If you took a closer look at our past tier list change logs, you'll realize this change has been on our minds for a little while. Quite a while, actually. The new expert tag revamp is a perfect to more accurately represent Chang Li's meta performance for casuals. Brant helps her cause a ton as a hypercarry unit, so she's very comfortable in tier 1. However, you can swap cancel so many of her abilities that she can work with almost all other DPS units in the game with the quick swap playstyle. People like Havoc Rover, people like a Zhang Liao, for example. Her versatility and viability at an expert level is so strong, it no doubt warrants her status of top tier. However, players who aren't willing to swap her every ability might experience some issues with her, namely somebody that's trying to avoid early onset arthritis. That's why I think Brant is so good, because Brant lets her be played in a way less APM intensive playstyle, still reach decent amounts of damage, and still get off some pretty damn good clears. She's still strong enough in that case, of course, just not top tier. So we deem this placement most accurate for her. So yeah, being played sweaty quick swap, tier 0, but majority of the player population is not really going to play her in that way, because let's be honest here, it's incredibly hard and not really accessible unless you're on PC. Kind of just completely inaccessible on mobile. With Dan Jin, the heal tag is added because she heals herself on her heavy attack. Jian has had the expert tag added, finally, thank God, and he goes up 1 spot. In our past tier list, we considered Jian getting an expert tag due to his double dragon rotation, providing a significant boost to his damage. However, it didn't warrant tier 0 performance. With more strong DPS units releasing causing his drop to tier 1, he can now comfortably wear the expert tag. So if you play Jian well, he's tier 0.5 alongside a character like Camellia, because he's still super strong himself if you're willing to properly execute optimized rotations. He has some pretty complicated team ones that you can do that, again, boost his damage by a lot. Mortifi is getting a bump up as well. He's not only strong with just Jian. Phoebe is one of the new candidates for the top 3 DPS units in the game, and he works brilliant with her, on par with Sanhua, because you simply use Spectral Rover as the healer in that team, and then Mortifi comes in as the sub DPS to buff her heavy attacks. She does 4 of them in her rotation, does a ton of damage, it's good stuff. This newfound flexibility in 2 top teams with both Jian and Phoebe warrants his ascension back to tier 0.5. And once we see the tier list itself, you're going to be a little bit surprised by what has happened to him. Zhang Liao has had the cancel tag added. Zhang Li may warrant an expert tag in the future because he's very swap cancel friendly in dual DPS team comps and can output ludicrous amounts of damage in the process. However, unless you play him like a speedrunner, which isn't what our expert tag covers, he doesn't warrant a tier 0 placement, so we won't add the expert tag to him. With that being said, if he were to ever drop to tier 1 with more powerful DPS units coming out in the future, think about maybe 2.6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 3.0, it's very likely he will get the expert tag on top of the cancel tag, so expect that to happen eventually. He's going to turn into a bit of a Chang Li in the future if the strength of DPS characters keeps increasing, but I don't think we're going to get there too fast. I think Kuro's done a good job of balancing a damage output. And with that, that's going to cover all the TOA changes. Let's get into WhiWa now. Brant's been added as a tier 1. In WhiWa, Brant is especially strong because he buffs Changli, who is without a doubt one of the top tier units. If you play the Brant Changli team, it is exceptionally strong in WhiWa because Changli is really good in WhiWa. He has a good amount of AoE in a lot of his abilities, and his Forte skill will just clear a wave like on its own. It hits like a truck. Save is Forte skill for the elites. However, almost all of his damage is concentrated within that single Forte ability, which causes issues to clear multiple smaller waves of enemies. And with Changli excelling in clearing those smaller waves of enemies, she shores up his weaknesses amazingly, and then Brant can just go in and take that wave of 3 elites and then blow them up in one skill. As a result, Changli prefers dual DPS playstyles with other characters, and he lands himself in tier 1 for now. Strong, but not the top of the tier. Kalcharo has had the expert tag added in WhiWa as well. WhiWa being exclusively AoE focused means it doesn't help Kalcharo, who has a ton of issues landing his death messengers on more than one enemy. It's possible, just very difficult. You have to orient yourself very well. He warrants expert +2 by being able to perform with proper positioning. However, for casual players, he'll always land in the bottom tier. We advise not to use him in the mode if you aren't willing to optimize a lot, and as we all know, Kalcharo is a character with a lot of optimizations. Carlotta's been buffed, and I fully agree with this. Carlotta should be going up from tier 1 to tier 1.5 to tier 1. She is, in my mind, still actually better than both Jinsei and Phoebe in the game mode, and so I kind of expected them to be dropped down a bit, and they have. Bit of a spoiler. Carlotta performed way better than expected when the team first tried her out. It turns out her abilities have just enough AoE that with minor amounts of positioning, which really isn't too difficult on her because she can gap close and teleport, she'll perform completely fine even as the sole DPS of the team. This comfortably justifies moving her up a tier. Fully agreed with you. I've been able to get easy WhiWa clears with the character after I've gotten some experience getting her rotations and placement down. Danjin gets the heal tag. It's the same exact thing as the prior tier list. And Jinsei's dropping down to tier 1.5 with the expert tag added. To say the least, Jinsei is difficult to make proper use of in WhiWa. We've seen it firsthand. Playing a Jinsei Jeja team in WhiWa is one of the worst experiences you have in the game. It requires a complete change in your usual playstyle to instead rotate fast with her on low stacks, typically in a dual DPS team comp. A character like Jeja or Yinlin with her is not actually the best. She kind of does better in dual DPS. I've actually done Carlotta and Jinsei to do a lot of clears for new player accounts. She practically necessitates that to perform, so we're dropping her to tier 1.5 and adding the expert +2 tag to her. Because the truth is, when you optimize Jinsei in this game mode, she's way up there as one of the highest performing units in the game, especially with Changli as her partner, because Changli does a lot of like incremental AoE damage on the side. And with Changli as her partner, the team has some of the highest damage potential out there. Completely agree with this, and I'm glad Phoebe's getting dropped down too. Mortefy's going from tier 1 to tier 0.5. Similarly to Carlotta, he's been performing better than expected. He has no AoE, but his buffs to Jian, who's pretty much the best WhiWa character in the game, are appreciated, and outside of dual DPS comps, Jian ends up performing well with Mortefy. This makes Mortefy warrant Apex character placement. He buffs the best character in the mode. That makes him one of the best characters in the mode. I'm glad to see a character like Mortefy at tier 0.5 in both of the game modes, which is, you know, solid stuff. Now let's move on to Phoebe. Bumped down with the expert tag added. She's very similar to Jinsei. In WhiWa, she particularly enjoys dual DPS playstyles and can perform amazingly well if you swap cancel a lot between her, a second DPS, and Spectral Rover. Spectral Rover needs to be the healer in these comps, and she needs to have another DPS as well on the side. And that's why both have the cancel tag. However, that playstyle is locked behind expert play, and without it, she has a fuck ton of issues in multi-wave. Let's be honest here. If you're a casual player, you're gonna blow shit up with Phoebe in TOA. You're gonna have no problem at all in the TOA if you're like not doing crazy swap cancels. You're just playing Phoebe's team really easily with low effort. In WhiWa, if you're not sweating your balls off with Phoebe, like canceling every time, reapplying Frazzle, doing all of this stuff, and then having the second DPS on the side to take care of enemies that don't have Frazzle on them, she is going to have a rough time. She is going to have a terrible time, and it is just not going to feel very good at all. That's just a thing that always occurs when it comes to Phoebe in this game mode. And so I'm glad that they're recognizing her strength, especially with the burst on her liberation and her outro skill. But the only thing is, I kind of wish they just had better buffs for her in the first place in WhiWa, and so that she doesn't need to be played in this super sweaty way for her to actually get some mileage. Farina's going up from tier 0.5 to tier 0. Yes, 1,000,000%. I agree with this. I've always been thinking Farina's less field time, less need for you know, the build up of the concerto has always made her a competitive pick, and in some ways even better than Shorekeeper in a lot of teams. They initially placed Verena below her because Shorekeeper has grouping, but let's be honest here, with proper character placement, you don't really need the grouping, and you can always just slot in Yang Yang. She has an AoE nuke, Shorekeeper, and stronger buffing. However, for our core casual audience, Verena may end up often outperforming Shorekeeper, so she warrants a tier 0 placement without a doubt. Agreed. I'm glad that they fixed this. I'm glad that they finally grouped them all together. It makes a lot more sense. Zhang Liao, the cancel tag is added. Refer to our TOA changelog. Exact same reasoning here. We've already covered that. Yinlin, placed on the watch list. Yinlin is somewhat of a question mark. After revising her rotations, we realized that the extra concerto energy she gains from multiple enemies possessing a mark at the same time isn't all too powerful. She gains a lot more concerto when she hits an AoE. With her heavy attacks, she skills in heavy attacks, she'll fill up her concerto almost immediately. Especially since her coordinated attack mark is not possible to upkeep across several waves of enemies. She's still strong, especially with Zhang Liao, however, so we asked for your feedback of whether she should be in tier 0.5 or tier 1. So if you guys have an opinion on it, make sure you go onto the Discord, start that discussion over there. I personally think that Yinlin having this much concerto, being this much of a battery, and also having a ton of AoE across pretty much all of her skills still makes her very solid. And now Jeja, dropped from tier 1 to tier 1.5. Jeja simply doesn't perform as well as we thought in WhiWa. She lacks big AoE abilities, her damage isn't sufficient to clear waves quickly, and she doesn't buff top tier units. She's good with Carlotta and Jinxie, sure, but even when she's optimized, she's not at the level of dual DPS playstyles with both. And believe me, if you're using Jeja with Jinxie, you will actually want to uninstall the game. If you're using Jeja with Jinxie, you will legitimately want to uninstall the game. It is so bad, it's absurd. Carlotta saves her placement a little bit by still being comparable to dual DPS comps. Carlotta and Jeji does work, somewhat, which isn't the case for Jinxie at all. True. However, she's dropping to tier 1.5 as a result. She has one team with Carlotta, and that team gets outperformed. Tier 1.5 is a pretty fair placement for her. So we've covered the tier list, a lot of movement, a lot of people getting upset potentially, especially of the placement of some characters and the bumping down of others. But based off of all the reasoning that I have seen here, this makes a ton of sense to me. And I don't think a lot of people that have been making comments like this, that have been trying to basically insinuate that Prydwen hates certain characters or that they're not doing their research, blah, blah, blah. You know, they're complaining about where Brant placed, even though they even openly said that they're judging it off of S0, R0. These people just don't read. Prydwen, with the explanation that we saw here, none of this seems fucking AI generated. Everything here has had a good reason for the explanation. I think that this might actually be one of the best tier list updates they've made. And so with that, we've gone through all of the words. Let's get into where the characters actually are. In Tower of Adversity, Apex characters, we're gonna have Carlotta, Jinxie, Phoebe. Makes sense. These are very easy characters to play in TOA, and they get the job done incredibly well. You then have Sanhua and Jeja. Sanhua over here just for that crazy fast rotation time, and then Jeja over here because she's one of the best single target sub DPSs in the game. And then Shorekeeper and Verena. They've been like this since they've launched. Makes a ton of sense. Then in tier 0.5, we have Camellia, Havoc Rover with S6, and then Zhang Liao, with Mortefi as now the only tier 0.5 sub DPS in the game. With the reasoning that they had, he buffs Gion and he buffs Phoebe, it makes sense. Not really a lot of other characters over here are gonna buff top tier characters like that. Gion has had the expert tag added, and so when he's played well, he's effectively a tier 0.5 character. And that means that Encore is the only true tier 1 character in here, kind of holding up the fort. Nobody in tier 0.5 for the DPSs, and then we've got kind of the rest of the squad, with Calcharo being bumped up to tier 1 if you play him well. And then we got the Chisha, Ling Yang, and Alto. They kind of just suck. Let's be real here. Moving on to the meta characters, and this is kind of what has likely pissed off a ton of people. There are 4 limited sub DPSs in tier 1. You're actually going to notice Jeja's the only tier 1 Apex sub DPS. Every single other one is in tier 1. And the reason for that is pretty simple. These characters are being judged without their weapons. These characters are being judged without their signature weapons. And while Chang Li on EOG will do just fine, especially when she's played super well and go all the way up to tier 0, a lot of these characters over here, when they don't have their signatures, kind of suck ass. Let's be honest here, Brant, without his sig, has some of it's not very good. It's just not very good. But when you do get a Sig, he's easily elevated maybe up to here or even up to here. That's my honest take on it. Yinlin without her Sig also sucks, and Rosia without a crit rate weapon kind of just doesn't do any damage, but she does have good buffs. Then we got Danjin holding up the fort with Expert, Yang Yang holding up, going up to tier 1 with Expert, and then Spectra Rover kind of just over here chilling, mainly as like a Phoebe buffer. They're only in tier 1.5 because of Phoebe. They would have dropped down lower without it. Then we got Janjin. I think Janjin could be dropped lower. She kind of just sucks in TOA for me personally. And then Lumi and Tauchi on the side. I think Lumi maybe has a bit more of a use case, and Tauchi a bit more as well. I think Tauchi could be bumped up because of how she works with Carlotta. Carlotta is a tier 0 DPS, right? And Tauchi is one of her best supports. If Carlotta has like 120 ER, that's something that we could look into. And then for the rest of the supports, Baizha, Yohu, Yanwu, just bid him. Get him out of here. It's fine. Just bid them. That's going to be the TOA tier list. Everything makes sense. I've already talked about some of the areas where I think they could alternate a little bit, maybe move some of the characters around. Now let's get into the WhiWa tier list. And boy, oh boy, nothing has really changed here. Nothing has really changed here. Mortefy's just bumping up compared to the last tier list. Verina's bumping up as well. And basically, Carlotta, Jinxie, and Phoebe are switching spots. This was the main change that I wanted to call out from the last update. Bump down Jeja, Phoebe, and Jinxie, and bump up Carlotta to tier 1. And it looks like they've done exactly that. These two characters have extremely poor performance unless you're playing them in some of the sweatiest ways possible. And Jeja is just complete dog shit. I honestly think Jeja could be bumped down to tier 2. I'm being honest. She is so unforgivably bad unless she's with just Carlotta. I think it warrants bumping her down even more. There are so many other 4-star characters I would rather have on the team than Jeja at this point. And Jeja only works with one other DPS who's in tier 1. I do think she could be dropped down lower, maybe to tier 2, and share the spot with Janjin. I'm being entirely real here. No other changes towards the bottom of the tier list. And of course, the other one that we talked about, right, was the addition of Brant over in tier 1. He supports Changli very well. She covers a lot of his weaknesses, but I think it's also fair to say that Changli might perform better with another DPS that isn't Brant in the first place, because his outro skill buff, which amplifies all of her damage, isn't really necessary because she's already one-shotting waves. So maybe with WhiWa's HP increases, Brant will get an increase as well, because he might let her reach the threshold of one-shotting waves, but currently she kind of already does that. And Verina being bumped up, perfect. Makes a ton of sense to me. So with that, Prydwen's made a lot of updates. One thing I wanted to check out was what their Brant page is looking like, specifically in things like their gameplay, their rotation. And we've already talked about what my rotation looks like. I just want to see what Prydwen is coming up with. Intro, skill, plunging attack, optional, immediately cancel with ultimate, and then ultimate. This skill over here, they're basically adding in a stopgap for Molten Rift, where Molten Rift, to gain its full bonus of 30% additional fusion damage, you have to basically use a resonance skill. And so putting that in here, great foresight, because there's going to be some people pulling Brant, putting him on the Molten Rift set, and then proceeding to use Emerald of Genesis. And so having this tech in here to basically, you know, streamline the activation of that set and maximize his damage, perfect. Great stuff. Love to see it. Love to see that, like that care, that attention to detail, right, put into some of the more free-to-play options. And then, yeah, pretty simple. Mid-air P2, charge, you flip, you do P3, you flip, and then you're going to have a full forte. We've seen that happen a bunch of times in my rotations. Synergies with teammates, Changli, Sanhua, Chisha, Encore, Verita, and Shorekeeper, makes sense to me. These are the exact teams that I've been using. I would also just say, hey, let's put in Carlotta in here, maybe Prydwen. I do think that Carlotta Brant is not bad at all. Brant has a pretty short rotation time, deals respectable damage, and will give Carlotta a 25% resonance skill damage amp. He's going to give her a 25% resonance skill damage amp. And you might as well put in or consider thinking about Jinxie too, right, in dual DPS. Because if Jinxie's going to work with Changli, I don't see why Brant wouldn't work with Changli. Brant honestly has a faster rotation time. He can cancel easily with Jinxie's mid-air attacks. And obviously, right, Brant's going to also buff Jinxie's skill damage. So it's definitely something that you could look into. Maybe there's just, this is a day 1 update, right? But that would be my suggestion. Putting in some more potential team comps or like some more thought on Jinxie plus Carlotta, because they're resonance skill damage dealers. He buffs that. Not the full amount that they might get from a character like Jeja if you're Carlotta, but he still buffs that. And it's pretty decent stuff. We might have to experiment around with it a little bit ourselves, but yeah, definitely something to look forward to in some of the future updates for this. But I have to say, this page is looking good. No real complaints at all with this page, except the addition of some more characters as more team comps are explored in the future. But as like a first sort of stab at it, it looks good. So with that, that's going to be our total comprehensive overview of this Prydwen tier list update. A lot of people got pissed off by these changes. But I have to say, all of the changes are completely warranted and they're well explained. And it just leads me to believe that some people are just looking at the tier list and not reading, and that's why they're getting pissed. And if you're doing that, that's a personal problem. So with that, let me know what you all think, and peace.